Afternoon. Good evening to those of you in Russia or Europe. My name is Matt Rajansky, and I'm the director of the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute. Thank you so much for joining us for today's talk, which honors the legacy and memory of Jim Billington by highlighting the research of our 2020 to 21 Billington Fellow, Dr. Yasha Klots. I'd like to start today, though, on a somber note. I want to extend my personal condolences and those of the Kennan Institute to the families of the victims of the mass shooting at Perham State University yesterday. This was really a shocking event to many of us, and it is very much a part of our scholarly community. The Kennan Institute has several scholar alumni from Perham State University and other universities in the region, and we would like them and all of our colleagues to know that we stand with you in demanding the right to teach, to research and learn in safety and in freedom. And Yasha, I know that you were born in Perham, so I'm sure this tragedy strikes especially close to home for you.
Thank you for the words.
In the course of today's program, you can submit questions for Yasha, which I will ask on your behalf via email to Kennan, Kennan @wilsoncenter.org. You can also tweet them at Kennan Institute or post them on our Facebook page. And please, so that I know who's asking the question, include your name and your affiliation if you have one with your question. When I met Jim Billington for the first time nearly 10 years ago, in fact, we discussed the vision behind the Kennan Institute. It's a vision he shared with the Institute's co-founders, Ambassador George F. Kennan himself and historian S. Frederick Starr, that scholarship of Russia must be at the heart of the Kennan Institute. That focus on scholarship was also the heart of Billington's career, and his impact on all of his endeavors, as he might have said, was on a Russian scale, that is, large. Billington's scholarship on Russia, his leadership of the Library of Congress, and his efforts in leading Track 2 between the United States and the Soviet Union were all exceptional, and they created lasting legacies. In the 1970s, he came to lead the Wilson Center on the condition of establishing here a national center for advanced research on Russia. He did just that. And now, nearly half a century later, scholarship supported by the Kennan Institute plays a key role in how Russia is understood in the United States. Chances are, if you study Russia in this country, you'll learn from an educator who has benefited from a Kennan Institute fellowship, grant, or conference. Jim Billington went on to a 28-year tenure as Librarian of Congress, and among many other accomplishments, he advanced the nation's understanding of and capacity to engage Russia. His success at the library in connecting American and Russian institutions and individuals, the Track 2 that I mentioned before, both before the end and after the end of the Cold War, is truly unparalleled. So looking back at Jim Billington's legacy and his contributions to the worlds of academics and policy, I'd offer the following observation. George Kennan may in fact be the author of Containment, but Jim Billington should be remembered as the author of Engagement with Russia. That legacy of engagement and of scholarship, of helping Americans understand Russia, is a legacy that we at the Kennan Institute cherish and that we strive to live up to every day. In my own view, and from the frankly diminished vantage point of my Zoom screen here in September of 2021, sustaining engagement with Russia in our current time represents a very different challenge than that of sustaining containment during the Cold War. But it's one that's both vital to our interests and quite difficult to pursue. We're hampered, of course, by the ongoing global pandemic, it goes without saying, but that is made worse by the dividing lines of deep disagreement on issues of principle, process, and national interest between our two governments. Increasingly, the intersection of all of these challenges makes people-to-people connections between Russians and Americans all the more rare and therefore certainly all the more vital to preserve. The reasons for this are myriad, but I'll go right to the heart of the matter and to a point that I know Kennan and Billington would have both endorsed. The further our peoples drift apart, the greater the chance for misunderstanding to escalate to the type of dangerous conflict we experienced and barely survived during the Cold War. So for anyone who might dismiss international scholarly exchange as merely a luxury for ivory tower academics, please understand that at least as I see it, and I believe as both Kennan and Billington saw it, it is a critical need for our nation. That's part of why in 2016, the Wilson Center launched the Billington Initiative to support the rising generation of Russian cultural historians, a celebration of both Jim Billington's legacy and the personal example of his scholarship and national service. The Billington Seminar, which we are marking today, is an integral part of that effort as it connects the scholarship of our Billington Fellows with a wider audience, including all of you today. Thank you very much for being a part of this effort, and it's now my very great pleasure to introduce our speaker, former Billington Fellow, Dr. Yasha Klots, whose biography I will very briefly offer to you now, that you can find it in full on the Wilson Center website. Yasha is an assistant professor of Russian at Hunter College, before which in 2016, he taught at the Georgia Institute of Technology, Williams College, and Yale University, before joining Hunter College in 2016. From 2014, he was a Humboldt Foundation Fellow at the Research Center for East European Studies in the University of Bremen. His research interests include Russian and East European emigre literature and book history, contemporary Russian poetry, linguistic anthropology, bilingualism and literary translation, Gulag narratives, in particular that of Varlam Shalamov, urbanism, the mythology of St. Petersburg, and representation of other cities in Russian literature. In 2010, he published Joseph Brodsky in Lithuania and co-translated Tamara Petkevich's memoir of a Gulag actress with Ross Ufberg. His most recent book is Poets in New York on City Language Diaspora, which includes his introduction and annotated interviews with 16 Russian and European poets. And he is currently completing a monograph, which I think we'll hear about today, entitled Tamizdat, the Cold War and Contraband Russian Literature in the 1960s and 70s, devoted to the circulation, reception, and first publications of manuscripts from the Soviet Union in the West. He also directs the Tamizdat Project, an online archive of documents on contraband Russian literature, and finally received his PhD in Russian literature from Yale in 2011 and his master's from Boston College in 2005, and indeed is an graduate of Perm State University. So without any further ado, Yasha, the floor is yours. Please don't forget, for those listening, you can email your questions, you can tweet them, or you can post them to our Facebook page, please.
Thank you so much for this most generous introduction, and of course for the wonderful 9 months I had spent as a Billington Fellow, if only remotely, but I hope we have time to catch up on in-person seminars in the future for me as an alumnus. It is a true honor, of course, to have borne the title of a James Billington Fellow, especially thinking of my own research topic and everything I will be pretty much saying today, starting with perhaps my choice of the main protagonist of today's story, Varlam Shalamov, who actually met James Billington in Moscow soon after he published his seminal work on Russia, the Icon and the Axe. They met at least once, and needless to say, the larger kind of topic or framework of my research, so-called Tamizdat, which I will say a few words in just a second, what it actually means and stands for, it is only available as a research topic today for me in particular and to other scholars, so much to such a large extent thanks to James Billington himself, even though he may not had the title of the Librarian of Congress just yet, but he is clearly someone who facilitated this immense collection of books in the Russian original, but also in translation across American university libraries and libraries, public libraries also. So without further ado, let me start by sharing with you just the front page. These will be slides, obviously, screenshots pretty much, of Tamizdat Project, which is, you have the web address down below and it's open and you can freely navigate it. It is, as the subtitle goes, it is an online archive of documents that help us reconstruct the history of the first publication, circulation, and quite importantly, reception of what we may call contraband Russian literature. Contraband in the most literal meaning of the word. Those are works that were smuggled out of the country. So those were manuscripts before they were published abroad that had to cross a state border. In my case, I only deal with the Russian Russophone Tamizdat literature. So in my case, it was the state borders of the former Soviet Union. And most often they would be published elsewhere, extraterritorially, in the US, among other countries, for the purpose of course, being sent back behind the Iron Curtain for, as so to say, weapons on the cultural fronts of the Cold War, because the period we are dealing with here is very much the Cold War, from the late 50s until after Perestroika and maybe even 91, when the Soviet Union officially ceases to exist. Of course, those more than 3 decades that the project covers, they were of course far from being similar to each other. Of course, there was the period of the thaw with Khrushchev's reforms that did reflect, or rather were very much reflected in the literary and cultural output. But then came the 70s, which saw, rather than, as well as the inflow of manuscripts, that decade, as well as the 80s, of course, saw the inflow of the new wave of Russian immigration, the so-called the third wave, right? So my story of the first publications, I should say in the plural, of Shalamov's prose, the cycle of his short stories, Kolyma tales, covers both of these periods, the thaw, or rather the end of the thaw, as well as the so-called stagnation era in the 70s. And I will probably stop in 78, having begun in 1966. 78 is when, after 10 years of being serialized in Russian immigrant journals, Kolyma tales for the first time are published as a book. So the project, again, you're more than welcome to ask me questions about the project itself later on, but also to explore it on your own. The project is at the intersection of library studies or library science, even geography, even political science. But first of all, it is, of course, about literature, broadly conceived. So it is not only fictional poetry, clearly it is mixed genres. And Shalamov's Kolyma tales is in some sense one of those, an example of a hybrid genre. So we will also talk a little about the specificity of his prose, which back in the days proved to be an obstacle and sometimes quite insurmountable for his first Tamizdat publishers abroad. Tamizdat, just kind of a very quick description, it literally, of course, it stands for published over there, right? And it's one of the 3 neologisms that are very much related, not just the words, but the phenomena that they stand for. The other 2 being Gosizdat, which means literally, again, etymologically stands for state publishing. That is the corpus of literary production texts that were published officially within the former Soviet Union, being officially sanctioned by state censorship. And Gosizdat, and I'm sorry, Samizdat, of course, which literally stands for self-published, not in a kind of chapbook way as some of us know it, but they were actually not published at all, right? So these were manuscripts and typescripts that circulated in the underground, again, only locally within the country, among a rather narrow circle of initiated readers who also continued to reproduce them, sometimes literally while reading those texts for the first time. And Tamizdat, in a sense, what makes it so interesting, to me at least, is that it combines the elements of both, right? Its fuel or driving vehicle is, of course, those manuscripts that get leaked abroad and published, elsewhere, but because they are published, and here you can see some covers, right? We are also, we cannot disregard the official kind of status of those publications, if only in a different geographical and literary cultural jurisdiction. So the story of the first publication of Shalamov's Kolymsky рассказы, Kolyma tales in Tamizdat begins actually where one might expect the story to end. It begins only months after the infamous Moscow show trial of Andrei Sinyavsky and Yuri Daniel in February 1966. And only 3 months after the trial, I'm saying it's infamous largely because the two writers were for the first time condemned to 7 and 5 years of hard labor precisely for publishing in Tamizdat. But only 3 months later, Shalamov's manuscript is smuggled out of the country and for the next 10 years serialized in the Russian Emigre Quarterly, Novy Journal in New York. I would like to suggest or even argue that as it was being published in New York and edited by Novy Journal's editor-in-chief Roman Gul, it was the formal and formalist orchestration of the Gulag topic in Shalamov's new prose, which he defined as neither memoirs nor short stories, not even literature as such, but quote-unquote prose suffered through like a document, проза выстраданная как документ. And it was the formal characteristics of Shalamov's Kolyma tales that very often remained virtually inaccessible to the Russian emigre community of the old generation, as well as, of course, to the Western reader, but for different reasons. Because the old generation of Russian emigres, those who left Russia in the wake of the revolution in the early 20s, or even after, during the war, the so-called second wave, they did apparently lack sufficient familiarity, right, with the Soviet vernacular, let alone, of course, a first-hand experience of the Gulag, where much of this language and Soviet culture in general had been tempered. And this decade that had passed since Shalamov's first manuscript travel abroad in 1966, and until Kolyma tales appeared as a book in London in 1978, it came between two distinct generations or formations of Tamizdat publishers and critics, exposing the stylistic and ideological controversies between them, which were fueled by their profound differences in linguistic and social cultural backgrounds, if only that. So the history of the first publication and reception of Kolyma tales in Tamizdat at the same time allows us to revisit this somewhat dated and traditional, almost binary, right, opposition of the official and underground fields of Russian literature in the late 60s and 70s. Introducing Tamizdat as perhaps the common denominator, or at least a third element that adds some kind of dynamic to this two-dimensional model. Adding to that model also its transnational and kind of transcontinental dimension. So since his return to the mainland from Kolyma, where he had spent 18 years in the deadliest camps of the Gulag, Shalamov was known in Russia as a minor poet, but not as a prose writer. With 5 collections of poetry published at home during his lifetime, there was only one short story that he managed to see published in Gossizdat, that is, officially in the Soviet Union. Abroad, Shalamov's reputation was quite the opposite. His poems left Tamizdat publishers and critics largely indifferent, again, partly because they were published in Russia, which very often disqualified those texts from being republished outside Russia, outside the Soviet Union. But Kolyma tales, perhaps the most merciless account of the Gulag ever committed to paper, did become a sensation. However, they did not become a literary sensation. It was, in fact, far from becoming a literary sensation, but became rather informational source. Shalamov's deliberately imperfect writing, meant to reflect the disintegration of both the body and the language of Kolyma prisoners, was taken for very often lack of literary mastery. So much so that Kolyma tales were even edited for publication in Tamizdat to make them fit the horizon of expectations of the local reader, and above all, the horizon of expectations of the editor himself. More importantly, of course, and even regardless of geography, it was the ultimate impossibility of translating Gulag experience in its extreme into any specific language, even one's native, that compromised the reception of Kolyma tales at home and abroad until much later, when this very futility of such an attempt was finally understood as perhaps the only available means to narrate Kolyma. So Kolyma tales first saw the light of the Novy Journal. This journal was founded in New York in 1942 as this transatlantic extension of Современные записки, Contemporary Notes, a legendary journal active in Paris before the war. From 1966, the editor-in-chief of Novy Journal was Roman Gul, a prose writer and memorist of the first wave of the Russian immigration, under whose leadership the journal entered its third stage of history, as Gul defines it, which began during the thaw, quote, when individual voices of writers and readers from the Soviet Union started reaching us here, end of quote. And among those voices was Shalamov's Kolyma tales. In December 1966, the first four short stories appeared in Novy Journal with this editor's preamble, which you can see on the screen here, in which Gul uses this rather standard disclaimer, right? Published without the author's knowledge or consent. Clearly, it was ever more important in the wake of Sinyavsky and Daniel trial that took place the same year, but it also made it impossible to say just how the manuscript ended up in New York. And it is something that Gul would reflect on only much later, already after Shalamov's death, in his memoirs, I Carried Russia Away, Я унес Россию. So in this quote from his memoir, he refers to the manuscript of Kolyma tales as perhaps the greatest gift to Novy Journal, as well, and also presents some details, including the fact that the manuscript was delivered to him by a professor of Slavic studies, who apparently met with the author in Moscow, and to whom Shalamov said that we are tired of being afraid in terms of publishing outside Russia. And he also gives a few specific details about the length of the manuscript, roughly 600 pages, etc. So from 1966, Novy Journal indeed published Shalamov more or less regularly. For 10 years, although some of his short stories appeared in other emigre journals as early as next year. And it is also true that Kolyma tales first appeared as a book in London in '78. However, it was brought out by overseas publications Interchange, which was founded in London under the auspices of Polonia Book Fund, and at the time was spearheaded by Andrzej Stypułkowski. But as the editor of Shalamov's volume, Mikhail Geller, specifies in his preface, he compiled it, quote, as accurately, given the absence of the author, as possible, from a manuscript that circulated in Samizdat. That is clearly not the same manuscript that Gul had at his disposal in New York. The total of 49 short stories that were serialized in Novy Journal in the course of 10 years could hardly exhaust the voluminous, large manuscript of about 600 pages, as Gul describes it, in which included short stories from Shalamov's 4 cycles of Kolyma Tales. Kolyma Tales is actually the title of just the first cycle, but also in an extended sense covers the entirety of the 4 cycles. This manuscript was, in fact, only recently I was lucky to discover it in a private archive. And it confirms not only that, but also the fact that Gul edited some of Shalamov's short stories, sometimes rather heavily, for publication in Novy Journal, about which I will talk in a second. So the professor of Slavic studies who delivered the manuscript to Gul in New York was famous scholar, Clarence Brown, a specialist on Osip Mandelstam from Princeton, who had since the early 60s collaborated with 2 other Russian-American publishers, Gleb Struve and Boris Filipov, on the edition of the first edition of Mandelstam's complete works. And again, as part of the newly instituted cultural and academic exchange, right, between the 2 countries, something that Matt was just saying, talking about, as an American exchange scholar, he traveled to Russia several times in the 60s, where he was a frequent guest at the apartment of the poet's widow, Nadezhda Mandelstam. Here you can see him sitting in front of her on the left side on one picture, and Shalamov with Nadezhda Mandelstam on the other picture. And both photographs come from Brown's papers at Princeton University. Shalamov must have passed the manuscript of his Kolyma Tales on to Brown no later than May 24, 1966, which is when Brown and Shalamov saw each other for the last time, according to Brown's Moscow journals, which are also held at Princeton University nowadays. In the words of Shalamov's friend and literary executor, Irina Sirotinskaya, who had met him, the author, earlier that same spring, this was the first and only attempt to transfer the manuscript of Kolyma Tales abroad that Shalamov himself authorized. But while it is hardly possible anymore to establish exactly what was said, by 1966, Kolyma Tales, as I mentioned, had crystallized already into separate cycles with very specific composition within each cycle. And it is unlikely that Shalamov wished or deliberately articulated his wish to see his short stories published abroad in a journal, that is separately and in a disjointed form. The manuscript must have been shipped from Moscow to the US by diplomatic pouch and reached Princeton no later than September 12, 1966, which is when Brown informs Gul that he just recently returned from the Soviet Union, but also brought with him a manuscript that may prove to be of explosive importance. I should like to show it to you, he writes. I have already offered an English translation, which in fact did not come out until 1980, etc., etc. So that is the first mention of the manuscript and of Kolyma Tales abroad, and actually ever in print. Well, it was a personal letter, but that's when it all starts. Half a year after the trial of Sinyavsky and Daniel, it was indeed hardly possible to offer Kolyma Tales for publication as a book to Boris Filipov, right, the head of the publishing house Interlanguage Literary Associates, whose name, as well as the name of his publishing house, became an anathema in Soviet Russia because he was publishing Terz and Darjak. In 1966, there were also rather few, if any, independent publishing houses of that would not be pretty much at the service of the American Secret Service's covert book projects, right? So it was before Ardis, it was before Max Hayward's Chekhov Publishing House that began in 1970. But still the question remains why the explosive effect of Kolyma Tales, as Brown put it, had to be postponed by more than by a decade. One of the reasons, of course, was that Shalamov's name was virtually unknown abroad and did not mean much to Gul personally. But the news of the manuscript could not leave the editor indifferent. So we can see his answer to Brown on September 15, 1966, in which he responds that clearly he would very much like to publish this material in his journal. And it so happens that just now he is putting together issue 85 for December of that same year. They met relatively soon, and on September 29th, Gull notifies Brown that he is returning him the manuscript and provides his kind of general opinion of Kolyma tales upon having just read them. In particular, he mentions the short story Sherry Brandy. Although he writes there is much unfulfilled in this story, but it is clearly written on the death of Mandelstam. There are texts that are completely bad, such as the Green Prosecute, etc., etc. There are those that require literary refinement. In short, thank you very much. He thanks Brown for familiarizing me with this manuscript. The fact of the matter is that the short stories are very monotonous and heavy in their themes. However, I consider the manuscript to be valuable. It should be turned into a small book, approximately 150-200 pages. No reader would be able to cope with more, end of quote. Answering Gull's letter, Brown warns him that Sherry Brandy was, quote, an imagined account of the death of Osip Mandelstam, as the author himself explained to me, end of quote, and that it could not therefore be treated as a mere documentary evidence of the poet's death and his last days in the transit camp outside of Vladivostok. No matter how important such evidence may have been at the time, when not even his widow knew the exact date, place, or cause of Osip Mandelstam's death in 1938. It was only later that we even know that the year. I hope, Brown wrote to Gull, that you somehow make this clear in an editorial note that it is fiction. But when Sherry Brandy did finally appear in Novo Journal, 2 years later, it was abridged and edited in such a way that it read precisely like a documentary account of the last days of the poet. Even if you do not read Russian, you can still see the extent, right, to which the original manuscript was edited by Gull. So in red, I highlighted parts of the text that were crossed out, and in green, those that were added. The last sentence, most importantly, that renders the poet's death as an allegory for his posthumous legacy. Therefore, he died earlier than the date of his death. Quite an important detail for his future biographers, was altogether discarded in the Novo Journal publication. And why is it important? That, of course, it is almost a very eerie detail, but rather ordinary at the same time, of camp life. After the death of Mandelstam, the legend has it his campmates would raise the hand of the corpse when bread rations would be distributed, so that they could get the bread ration for 2 more days. Gull was not the only emigre critic of his generation who was frustrated with Sherry Brandy. And after his improvements, the short story outraged the critic and poet of the first wave of the Russian immigration, Yuri Terepiano, in Paris, who accused Shalamov of treating Mandelstam's death perhaps too frivolously. Especially now, he writes, when what actually happened to Mandelstam in the transit camp is known only by hearsay, his death should not have been turned into a work of literature. Sherry Brandy, Terepiano lamented, touches us in a rather unpleasant way. Нас несколько неприятно задевает. While the dying poet's thoughts on having written bad prose in the past and having had no pupils, as Shalamov writes in his short story, raises the question, what gives Shalamov the right to make Mandelstam speak of his prose in such a way? And what makes him think that Mandelstam has not influenced contemporary poets? So sharing Gull's reading of Sherry Brandy merely as a source of information on life in the camps, Terepiano underscored that the most important thing in Kolyma tales for us has been their truthfulness, although far although as far as the form is concerned, Shalamov is also a talented storyteller. Unaware that he was actually reading Gul's version of Shalamov's Kolyma tales, he was therefore praising not the author, but the editor of Novy Journal as a talented storyteller. Gul himself admitted having edited Shalamov's texts in his letter to Jerzy Gedroic, the publisher of the journal Kultura and head of the publishing house Instytut Literacki in Paris in the Polish language, when Gedroic expressed an interest to publish Shalamov as a book in Polish translation. For that reason, because of Gul's confession that it is not good to publish Shalamov directly from the manuscript, but he also edited the short stories, so he does not know how to go about it. Because of all this, the plan to publish Shalamov in Polish had to be withdrawn, at least for the time being. And the correspondence between Roman Gul and Jerzy Gedroic also breaks off. As for Gul and Braun, their correspondence ends rather soon too, in 1971, when Braun communicates finally to the editor of Novy Journal that Kolyma tales should at least be published in the order in which they were included in the original manuscript. All later editions, including the first book published in London in 1978, opened with the sketch "Po snegu," trampling the snow, whose seemingly artless plot reflects not only the composition of the first cycle, but also Shalamov's entire oeuvre, and by extension, perhaps Gulag narratives as a genre at large. Each step of a prisoner marching in a column through the deep snow leaves an imprint, as long as it does not overlap completely with the footprints of another prisoner marching ahead. And as Leona Tolker has pointed out in her monograph on Gulag narratives, the final sentence translates this ordinary scene of camp life into an allegory. The snow becomes a blank page. The allegory suggests a line of literary inheritance between different authors who have survived the Gulag, whereby each of their texts is destined to leave a new trace in the reader's vision of the reality described, as long as it adds something new. In an extended sense, the entire tradition of Russian prison camp writing is thus conceived of as a file of prisoners beating a path through the snow, where every author is also bound to play the role of a reader, of those who came before him, of times and places they had not been to or witnessed firsthand. And more specifically, trampling the snow also points to, of course, the internal organization of Kolyma tales, where each short story stands in its right place, quote unquote, as Shalamov declares in his programmatic essay on prose, written in 1965. And yet still an entire decade had to pass before Shalamov's creative design could be heard and before Kolyma tales was first published and read precisely as a book. He was of course aware and saw, had them in his home library, the first issues of Novy Journal with his publications. And frustrated with how his manuscript was handled in Tamizdat, also disillusioned with the dissident movement at home. On February 15, 1972, Shalamov writes his ill-fated letter to the editor of Literaturnaya Gazeta, which begins with the words, "I became aware that the anti-Soviet petty journal Pasev, printed in Russian in Western Germany, as well as the anti-Soviet emigre journal Novy Journal in New York, have decided to take advantage of my good name as a Soviet author and citizen and are printing Kolyma tales in their slanderous publications. Protesting against being represented as an anti-Soviet writer and an internal emigre, Shalamov concludes his letter with a phrase that would cost him dearly, both in Russia and abroad. Quote, for a long time now, the problematics of Kolyma tales has been removed by life. Проблематика колымских рассказов давно снята жизнью. The letter appears in Literatурная газета, one of the major Soviet periodicals, soon after the first secretary of the Soviet Writers' Union, Georgy Markov, made Shalamov an offer to have his fourth book of poetry, Moskovsky Облака, published in Russia without delay in exchange for public renunciation of the illegal publications of Kolyma tales in Tamizdat. And contrary to some early assumptions that the letter was a forgery or a document Shalamov was forced to sign, there is now very little doubt that it was genuine, largely because of the very specific language and epithets he embeds in this otherwise rather standard text. For example, the epithet "zlовонные журнальчики," foul-smelling journal, with this diminutive suffix, that is a reference, as Leona Toker has argued convincingly, to the political debates of the 1920s and to the left opposition to which Shalamov himself belonged before even his first arrest in Moscow. The technique on the whole was not uncommon, of course, among Soviet dissidents and intellectuals. I'm quoting Toker, who wished to acquaint the readership with some unacceptable theories by attacking such theories while explaining them in detail in the process. So to put it simply, it is for the first time ever that the title, Kolymskie рассказы, Kolyma tales, is ever makes it onto the pages of the official Soviet press. And of course, the inquisitive reader would immediately ponder the question as to where Kolyma tales could be found. So it is a veiled message, clearly, but in 1972, Shalamov's public repentance could not but shock its readers both in Russia and abroad, and its subtexts remained eclipsed by the literal meaning of what the text of the letter said on the surface. A month after the letter appeared, an émigré newspaper in Paris read an anonymous column by a recent arrival from the Soviet Union titled "Упразднение Колымы," Undoing Kolyma. The newspaper was then edited by Princess Zinaida Shakhovskaya, a poet and memoirist of the first wave, who wrote in her introduction, and quoting, "Two assumptions inevitably come to mind. Either Shalamov has sold out, сучился, or he has always been one of theirs, an informer, стукач. A third assumption is also possible, that he was forced to write the letter, although this version gives no credit to the author of Kolyma tales either." And the anonymous author of the article itself was actually familiar with Shalamov through Samizdat while he still lived in Russia. He mentions, among others, the dissident Andrei Amalrik, who at the time was still doing time in Kolyma, despite Shalamov's claim that the problematics of Kolyma tale has been removed by life, and addresses Shalamov directly. Quote, Varlam Tikhonovich, he wrote, "Everyone is responsible for what he is worth. As an old-timer of the camps, you too may be told, you have sold out. Вы сучились." I should probably mention that this verb, сучиться, in the Soviet criminal jargon, means to betray the code of honor of professional thieves and start collaborating with the camp or prison authorities and with the regime at large. In the dissident circles in Russia, the reaction to Shalamov's letter produced a similar outcry. In a footnote, most notably, to the Gulag archipelago, Solzhenitsyn, who in 1972 was still living in Russia, proclaims that Shalamov has died. The renunciation came out in a black frame, he writes in that footnote, and so we all understood that Shalamov was dead. No matter how much Solzhenitsyn may have disapproved of Shalamov, it is of course hard to imagine that an expert in Soviet publishing and politics that he was, could seriously take polygraphy for the actual news of his fellow writer's physical death. Rather, it was Solzhenitsyn's literary rivalry with Shalamov that was at stake. And let me not go too far into it, but let me only mention that their relationships and even attempts to collaborate on the Gulag topic were doomed not just because Shalamov hoped to say a word of his own as a writer in Russian prose on this topic especially, but mainly because he rejected Solzhenitsyn's literary method, including that of his pseudo-socialist realist novel, the groundbreaking One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, that was triumphantly published in Gossesdat as early as 1962. And that, of course, overshadowed, if not eclipsed, most works on the Gulag subject ever since, both in Russia and abroad. To be fair, not everyone in the old Russian emigration found Shalamov's prose aesthetically inferior or less readable as Solzhenitsyn's. In fact, the first review of Kolyma Tales Abroad, published by Georgy Adamovich in '67, so months after the first publication of the first short stories took place, it stated that Kolyma Tales were in fact, quote, more frightening than One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which became famous worldwide. Hard labor in Shalamov's short stories not only pursued, but fully accomplished its goal. Не только сделала, но и окончательно доделала свое дело. Something that never takes place in Solzhenitsyn's novella, end of quote. But for the overwhelming majority of emigre critics of Adamovich's and Gull's generation, it was, of course, Solzhenitsyn and not Shalamov who personified nonconformist Russian literature and the stronghold of the anti-Soviet movement, which in the climate of the Cold War was, of course, what really mattered. More than 10 years later, this ideological and rather binary engagement of Tamizdat critics and publishers of the old formation played out on a new level in the reception of Shalamov's first separate book edition. It was brought out in London in '78, as I already said, I think twice, and in a sense marked a new era in Tamizdat publishing that was gradually rejuvenated by new arrivals from the USSR, whose carry-on cultural and physical baggage included not only new manuscripts, but also more intimate first-hand familiarity with the Soviet language and culture, which the older generations of the first and second wave emigration lacked. However, as becomes clear from the reception of the first book edition of Kolyma Tales across two generations of Tamizdat critics and publishers, the disagreements between them over Shalamov were far from purely aesthetic, as Andrei Sinyavsky would have it, and as he actually referred to his disagreements with the Soviet regime in the 80s already. Compiled by Mikhail Geller, an historian and political prisoner before he emigrated to Warsaw in '57 and then on to Paris in '68, Shalamov's book came out with a drawing by Boris Sveshnikov, which looked like a portrait of the author in the upper left corner of this green cover, and the dust jacket as well. And the way Kolyma Tales had been published in Tamizdat previously, according to Geller, was like, quoting his preface, a Rembrandt painting discovered in an attic, cut into small pieces and displayed as a pile of scraps. In these disjointed pieces, one might still recognize a great work of art. Here is an eye, here is an arm, but there would be no painting, end of quote. And still, Geller laments there was no Russian book. But then the book was finally out. It was the old emigres' turn to settle scores with Shalamov's new publisher and brand the edition as a weighty cobblestone, увесистый булыжник, and an extremely unfortunate, крайне неудачная publication as a whole. This first and only review published in the newspaper Русская мысль in Paris belonged to Gennady Andreev or Gennady Khomякov, a wartime emigre author and Tamizdat publisher who, among other things, for the first time published Akhmatova's Requiem in 1963. He was the head of Товарищество зарубежных писателей publishing house in Munich. Indeed, the book's bulky format of 896 pages complicated the task of sending it back to the Soviet Union and thus undermined the political mission of Tamizdat, which treated contraband manuscripts from the USSR, especially those on the Gulag topic, which, needless to say, was the hottest topic of the Cold War, as weapons on the cultural fronts of that same Cold War. I'm quoting Andreev here from his review. We have always considered the publication of Russian books abroad, whose main reader is in Russia, from the perspective of sending those books back behind the Iron Curtain, Andreev admits. It was a mission that Tamizdat publishers of the old generation, more often than not, placed above the aesthetic merits of Russian literature even after the curtain began to rust. Invoking Shalamov's letter to Literatурная газета, Andreev mentioned Solzhenitsyn's condemnation of it and blamed the author of Kolyma Tales for writing, quote, unkindly, without a shadow of gratitude, end of quote, about those who had helped him survive in Kolyma. Like Solzhenitsyn, Andreev questions Shalamov's belief that, quote unquote, again, the camps are a negative experience for a human being from the first to the last hour, and that no one should even hear, in fact, about them. Shalamov's rejection of the very idea of the camps, that the camps could bear a positive effect on the prisoner, ran against the life-affirming pathos of Solzhenitsyn and socialist realism at large, of course. In fact, it stands much closer to Primo Levi's observation about Auschwitz, where only, quote, the worst survived, the selfish, the violent, the insensitive, the collaborators of the gray zone, the spies, end of quote, from Primo Levi. As it happens, however, before Geller, it was Andreev Khomякov who first collected Shalamov's short stories for the Future edition. In 75 and 76, upon moving to New York from Munich, he helped Gul edit Novy Journal. For example, on August 1977, in a letter to Yuri Ivas, Khomякov wrote that in the spring he had collected all of Shalamov's short stories, 200 pages or so, and even wrote a preface for the Future edition. I have sent them to the publisher, he continues, but the book, well, but there is a delay. So he would not hear anything back for a very long time, and in fact, only heard that the book is out already after it was published. He did not know that in the meantime, yet another comprehensive manuscript had reached Geller in Paris, making Khomyakov's work on the volume as well as his preface ultimately redundant. Khomyakov's unpublished preface, however, held among Geller's papers in Paris, is different from the frustrated review in Русская мысль, which he wrote already after the book was out, clearly. It is different not only in length, but also in tone. And also it sheds light on Khomyakov's own biography before the war. He lamented the nuisance of having to compile the book without being able to consult the author directly. Khomyakov's preface makes clear that the book was, in fact, the book that he was compiling was going to open with the short story Как это началось, How it began, whose title deceptively promises a historical account of Kolyma camps, unlike, for that matter, Trampling the Snow, which offers instead a compositional allegory for Kolyma tales, and by extension Gulag narratives as a genre. How it began, though, is not a piece of mere documentary or historical evidence either. Its first paragraph ends with a phrase that is left deliberately unfinished. In English, it's translated as follows: in autumn, we were still work. And in Russian, it sounds like осенью мы еще рабо. As this truncated language of this first sentence suggests, history itself suffers irreparable damage in Kolyma. where time itself acquires another dimension, and therefore the historical subject matter of Kolyma tales alone is rather misleading in establishing the order in which the short stories should follow. And still, for Khomякov, Kolyma tales were only eyewitness accounts, written, again, a quote, in the traditional Russian realist manner without pretentiousness or attempts at unnecessary modernism. It is a small world, Khomякov wrote in his unpublished preface, and the world of the concentration camps, a multi-million one, is probably not so large either. Himself a prisoner in the Gulag in 1927 through 1935, Khomякov recognized several names and people in Kolyma tales. Those included the infamous NKVD official Rodion Vaskov. The prison in Magadan, which Shalamov knew firsthand, was called Vaskov House. But Khomякov often saw Vaskov in the early 30s in Syktyvkar, where he was working for the camp administration, quote unquote. There was also a personal acquaintance by the name Pisnyakevich, who at the same time is a character of Shalamov's short story Protezi, Artificial Limbs, where Pisnyakevich is portrayed overseeing the operation of stripping prisoners of their prostheses before throwing them to the punishment cells. In Syktyvkar, where Khomякov worked at the camp's finance department and was in charge of payments to the free workers and the guards, Pisnyakov, in his turn, was responsible for hunting down fugitives and rewarding the free residents of the nearby villages for their collaboration. In short, it is simply a term that I would like to use here as an example of the camp jargon. Khomякov was a trustee, or a pridurok, as trustees used to be called in the Gulag, holding privileged jobs and working for the Gulag administration, if only as a prisoner, until his release in 1935. Well, two other reviews, and this is where I will stop, of Kolyma tales were authored by critics of the younger generation, Violeta Iverny and Andrei Sinyavsky, both of whom emigrated to Paris already in '73 and kind of personify this new cultural carry-on baggage, right, that I mentioned earlier, that they brought with them, and that constitutes a rather different reception of the same text by Shalamov in question. Iverny, speaking of the infringements on literary conventions that older emigres considered as flaws, admits that they may, that those flaws, right, so-called flaws, may equally result from Shalamov's manuscripts being passed from hand to hand, and from typewriter to typewriter in Tamizdat, as well as from the author's profound and quite deliberate neglect of literary conventions as such. Indeed, she writes, if the society's moral laws prove to be so fragile and unviable, what can be said about the laws of literature, which in inhuman conditions become but a meaningless and an incredibly expensive toy in the hands of the lucky ones who have been allowed to live? Imperfect as Shalamov's book may be, it was only after Kolyma tales were brought together under one cover that it became clear why his prose had been often regarded as flawed. Time, Iverny says, has no continuity in Kolyma. It had stopped and been frozen there. Time had the qualities of light and darkness replacing each other, but it had lost its main feature, flow. Hence, numerous inconsistencies in Shalamov, utterly inappropriate, of course, by traditional realist standards. Hence, also the opening sketch Trampling the Snow, which attempts to give some direction of flow to the constituent parts of Kolyma tales and Gulag narratives as a genre at large. Finally, the other, let me just wrap up here using the example of Sinyavsky's review, or in fact, a full-scale article devoted to the first book of Shalamov's prose published in '78. He tells us, the readers, a chilling legend from the camps, which he had himself heard in Mordovia in the '60s, where he was sent for 7 years for being published in Tamizdat earlier. The legend about how prisoners in the Gulag decided to let the world know about what Stalin's hard labor really stood for. Incapable of coping with the work quotas, they would mutilate themselves and pack their fingers and wrists in the cords of timber exported to England, where the recipients of this eerie cargo got the message and stopped their rather otherwise lucrative trade with Stalin. But the failure of the language to communicate Kolyma experience was part of the message embedded in Shalamov's manuscript. That message, I should probably conclude and say, that was largely lost on his first publishers, who truncated, for example, the final sentence of Sherry Brandy, turning the short story into a kind of stump. And 10 years later, for the first time introducing Kolyma tales as a book, and in order to place Shalamov's nightmarish phantasmagoria in context, Geller cites Evgeny Zamyatin, who wrote back in 1922 that today, in 1922 that is, when, quote, the apocalypse can be published as our daily newspaper, art that responds to contemporary reality can only be the fantastic. But while Zamyatin's own famous dystopia We, written in 1920, but for the first time published in Russian only in 1952, the book that was incriminated to the author in 29 for being published abroad, and making it perhaps possible to trace Tamizdat as a Soviet phenomenon back to that year, 1929, when it became reprehensible. While this book by Zamyatin, the dystopian novel We, was set in the hypothetical distant future, Shalamov's Kolyma tales were written, or should I say authored, by the historical reality itself of the still recent past, which was far more fantastic, quote unquote, than science fiction could ever imagine. Let me perhaps stop here, and thank you so much for listening to me for such a long time. But I hope we still have time for some questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yasha. Let me remind those who'd like me to pass along your question. You can email them to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, tweet them at Kennan Institute, or post them on the Facebook page. I will start with maybe some broader questions of my own. One thought that I think you touched on briefly, I'm sure it's been relevant to your work before, is the generational change in the publishing, the Russian language emigre publishing world outside of Russia, from the generation which had pre-revolutionary, sort of white Russian experience and then carried that on outside of Russia, versus by the middle of the century, you have people who are born outside of the Soviet Union. And then, of course, later you have generations of people born in the Soviet Union who, for example, in World War II, who are not white Russian emigres. I wonder if you can talk about what kind of difference that makes in terms of the reception of literature coming out of the Soviet Union.
Right. This is, I guess, the essence of the patterns, right, of reception of Kolyma tales, because we could trace it through the 3 generations that Matthew just listed. First, the patterns of reception among the first wave of Russian emigres were largely contingent, depended on the fact that, yes, they simply lacked this language, this culture, that experience, which we cannot really say about the so-called second wave, right, or the wartime immigration, to which belonged Khomякov. I mentioned that he spent 7 years in the camps, in whichever capacity, of course. So he was intimately familiar with this frame of reference. For them, however, there was a more it was perhaps a bit more pragmatic and even not so much ideological, but their reputations were a priori compromised, both in Russia, right, where they could clearly not return because they had essentially defected, right, with the retreating German army very often, and many of them were collaborators during the war. Or it so happened that they ended up in the West, right, as it's somewhat euphemistically often referred to, right, during the war ended up in the West. Во время войны оказался на Западе. Whatever that means. So it's a very kind of uncomfortable topic and a very uncomfortable status for them, not only from the Russian or Soviet perspective, but also from the Western one, because they hope to continue their careers, and they did continue their careers after the war, and often in the US, of course, which again, Khomyakov's example personifies. And then for them, Shalamov, with his rather categorical rejection of the cultural values, right, of the Russian immigration, and even Akhmatova, who declares in the epigraph to her requiem that she was there with my people, where my people unfortunately were, right, я была с моим народом, там, где мой народ к несчастью был. In this epigraph and in such statements, they intuited, and rightly so, a rather unequivocal ideological position of the authors inside the Soviet Union, from which they were separated not only geographically, but also historically and stylistically, as we could tell. The third wave of the Russian immigration that does not start really until the early 70s, and which is largely Jewish immigration, it is also largely a product of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, right, which was essentially the kind of economic tool of political influence. It was entirely different because on the one hand, many of the third wave emigres, most of them, even if they did not spend time in the camps themselves, still internalize this cultural code, right? And if they did spend time in the camps, it would not be Stalin's camps exclusively, right? It would be the post-Stalin Gulag. On the other hand, when they came abroad and started establishing their own journals and publishing houses like Sinyavsky, like Geller in some sense, they would not be accepted very often by the old institutions, right, of the Russian diaspora, and they had to formulate their own identity against the background of the older Russian immigration. Solzhenitsyn here is an interesting exception because historically and biographically, clearly he belongs to the third wave, right? But ideologically and stylistically even, he found support among the first Russian immigration, much more so than among his fellow third wave immigrants. Hope it answers it at least a little, but yeah, thank you.
It does, Yasha, and of course, any mention of Solzhenitsyn opens up, as you may know, a very extensive project that we have done, also in the spirit of Billington, with the unpublished Solzhenitsyn, or the untranslated Solzhenitsyn's works, the latter volumes of The Red Wheel and Two Millstones. And so I myself have spent much time contemplating exactly that interesting dynamic of cross-generational kind of affiliation of Solzhenitsyn's writing and his thinking. And also, by the way, skipping forward to the contemporary generation, the ways in which Solzhenitsyn's thinking is enjoying a renaissance, perhaps even in the Kremlin. And that kind of brings me to a contemporary question, which is, take off for a second your hat of historian as historian and think about any parallels to today's sovereign internet in Russia. And to pretend that Telegram is literature, but after all, we see real constraints on publishing thought, including publishing narrative thought about political conditions in the country. How do you see the opportunity to express oneself on platforms outside the country, but which are banned within the country? I mean, again, I don't want to try to make this analogy too perfect, but how do you see that phenomenon today?
Right. So ironically, to explore the perils and dangers and all kinds of other hoops and obstacles of disseminating print editions back in the days, in the late 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, Tamizdat Project resorts to digital means, right? And it is ironic because arguably it's not just the political change of the late 80s and early 90s that made Tamizdat obsolete and have pushed it into history. It became history ever since. But it was also largely, and maybe largely, a technological change, of course, because the rise of the internet in the early 90s, around the same time as the fall of the Soviet Union and state censorship, kind of drove the ultimate decisive nail into the coffin of Tamizdat, if I may say so. And Tamizdat did not really repeat itself ever since, no matter how much of a battlefield internet has become, right? It has clearly gone a very long distance from being conceived of as the ultimate freedom of speech in its early days to yet another warfare, cyber warfare, with all kinds of consequences, of course. And yet it is something that, as far as literature is concerned, at least, and perhaps nowadays it's very different, because it's still possible, right, to publish any what we conventionally call literature inside Russia, but hardly possible to publish something in mass media, let alone and verbalize this on TV channels, right? So this has been separated, the genres. So it's not just, there are lots of factors here, but one thing is clear, that not only does internet still make it possible to publish everything in just a few clicks, right? So what used to be a very complicated and dangerous and lengthy typical Tamizdat operation has now shrunk to just a few clicks this time. And geography, in some sense, simply ceased to matter, right? Geography in its kind of physical dimension, but yet it has been virtualized, right? And become very much more abstract. So that is as much as I can talk about it, I think, not being an expert on internet security policies. Yeah, but there is definitely some kind of lesson maybe to be learned from the days before internet.
Well, and I actually think that your comment, in a way, suggests the possibility that sovereign internet as such has it wrong, that the internet is divisible into different controllable spaces of publishing, just any platform, but they're not divisible based on national boundaries. They're divisible based on platforms, based on, you know, sort of different levels of consumption. For example, the typical audience for a tweet is probably not the same audience for a long form, you know, ebook or even a blog. But, you know, this somehow this notion of sovereign internet, although it may be serving the purposes of the Kremlin at this time, is a bit of an anachronism that attempts to recreate something which actually can't be recreated. Please go ahead if you.
No, exactly as you say, the bottom line here is what patterns have the ability or potential to repeat and what simply don't, right? And given how much the context, the media context has changed. Yes, let's keep thinking about this for the future.
I have a bit of a strange question. I have not actually read a proper biography of Shalamov, but I came across in his Wikipedia, biographical entry, this interesting note about his father. I guess his name was Tikhon Shalamov, who was a missionary for 12 years in Alaska.
That's true.
Which raises the question for me as an American who grew up on the West Coast, where I think Alaska certainly enjoys a place in the imaginations of the white immigration. There was a large white immigration on the West Coast of the United States. I'm curious about kind of both directions of perception. Shalamov talk at all about the United States in the context of something that, it was American territory in the late 19th century when his father was there. His brother lived there, I guess. He wasn't born until after they came back, but it seems like it would be kind of a big factor in his early life.
Well, to the extent that Alaska was perceived as an American territory or as a Russian territory, right? That would be the ultimate kind of measure of how marked, right, that could have been in Shalamov's family history. But no, it's surprisingly and kind of ironically in this context that, but the reason is that, of course, he rejected pretty much his father's faith and the way he was brought up, and has one short story that I can cite as an example called The Cross, where a pious religious family during famine, well, splits the cross into parts and sell it not to die from starvation. So that is Shalamov's very eloquent verdict, perhaps, as to what faith really matters during the years of Stalinism, when not that it helped his parents, for instance, very much, but elsewhere, of course, he has characters who are the so-called sectarians, right? Sectanti, his fellow prisoners in Kolyma, who very often proved to be the most enduring, precisely because of the inner faith they had.
Maybe, Yasha, a fitting way to conclude the Billington seminar would be for you to talk a little bit about the project itself, the Tamizdat Project itself, in terms of archiving and sort of serving the function of repository. What do you see as the biggest challenge that you face in this type of effort going forward? Where is more investment needed and more resources needed? And what do you think is the best case that could be made for that, especially for those of Billington's colleagues today in the Library of Congress and other great libraries of the world?
Thank you for giving me this opportunity once again to talk about the project, which is very much on my mind for the past 3 years, ever since it's been launched. The greatest challenge is perhaps its sheer scope, because we are talking here, no one counted, of course, but we are talking about the perhaps 70% of what's nowadays considered the contemporary Russian literary canon of the 20th century. Most of what we teach, read, and very freely buy from around the corner or from Amazon nowadays most of those works were first published elsewhere in relation to where they had been written long before they could see the light of day in Russia, right? So Bulgakov's The Master and Margarita, of all examples. I mean, it was published in Moscow also, but in a different redaction. Or Собачье сердце, The Heart of a Dog, beats the record, perhaps written in 25, not published in Russia until 88, but it was published abroad in Paris and in Germany in 68, so some 20 years before. That is the challenge, because clearly the amount of reviews and all kinds of accompanying documents, materials, is simply overwhelming. And I would have never been able to do tiny part of what Tamizdat Project has so far accomplished, even though it's always a work in progress, without dozens of volunteers from around the world who somehow want to study and know how those books that shape their identities were first published and read. So working with the volunteers is a very rewarding part of my directing this project, has been at least for 2 years already. Of course, it's historical, right? The project which we were just talking about, internet, kind of doing Tamizdat in, but so theoretically it is finite, right? There were only so many editions, and hopefully there would not be another kind of Tamizdat practice or institution in the future. But the scope, the website is constantly populated with new materials. It's also bilingual, so there is always need to translate the documents, reviews, diary entries back and forth from Russian into English and vice versa, but also from other languages in which Tamizdat may have been covered, right? Back in the days, in French, in German, of course, in Italian. I've been working with University College of Amsterdam with student interns from that school, and they have been translating from Dutch into English. Also, the sheer kind of scatteredness of archives around the world, not only in the libraries, but also in private collections, such as the manuscript that I was showing from a private archive. Who knew that it would turn up in this specific private archive, if not pure chance, right? Of course, permissions is very much on my mind right now, starting with images and authorization of newspapers to reproduce excerpts, if only excerpts, of the materials they first published. Many of the personalia of what the website refers to as profiles, many of these figures who were crucially important, even smugglers, right? Perhaps the most important, right, part of a Tamizdat operation was to smuggle out the manuscript. But because, for obvious reasons, for conspiracy purposes, their names were not very often mentioned, if they were at all. So it's always detective work, making it difficult to find traces of these people or their heirs to turn to for permissions, or so it is justified clearly by fair use and non-commercial purposes. The goal is, of course, to make this story complete. When you open a Wikipedia entry about the heart of a dog, you would not necessarily read where it was for the first time published. So I realized that this page, or this kind of thread, perhaps rather than the page, of Russian literary history has been very, it's a dashed line, right? It's not a solid thread that you could trace. And the idea is that it's very much the backbone of Russian literary history at the same time, which needs to be reconstructed.
Well, I think that's a very good capturing of the essence of the work of archivist and historian, and I think it's something I feel safe saying that Dr. Billington would have very deeply appreciated. So your fellowship, your research, your time at the Kennan Institute, and your project looking forward, I think are all wonderful tributes to the Billington memory. Thank you, Yasha, so much for joining us today. And let me just remind those who are listening live or recorded that you can always stay up to date with the Kennan Institute through our website. And please, in particular, follow our podcasts, Kennan X and the Russia File, wherever you get your podcasts, and take a look at our blogs, the Russia File and Focus Ukraine. And with one more big thank you to Yasha, I will see you all next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.